Hi, I'm Jarrett Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. When you hear the term digital design, what do you think of? Apps, probably, maybe websites or animations or even virtual reality. All of those things are, of course, correct, but today in 2023, we can really think of all design as digital design. The books on your bookshelf were designed using digital software. Brand systems are built with computers. Architects use modeling software. Even physical experiences like retail stores or event spaces are usually conceived of on screen first and then plastered with images that were done on computers. So, if everything is digital design, what does it mean to write a book on the history of digital design? This is how Stephen Eskilson opens his new book called, and you guessed it, Digital Design, A New History. When I opened the book, I expected a history of apps, of websites, of animation, and all of that is here. But Stephen also writes about the tools of design. He writes about architecture. He writes about industrial and product design. To write a book about digital design history to me seemed like a challenge, both in scope, but also in the pace and rate of change. And I asked Stephen on the show to talk through this process and about why and how he wrote this book. Stephen is trained as an art and design historian. He's a professor of art and design history at Eastern Illinois University. And I first read him years ago, like I bet many listeners of this show did, when he wrote Graphic Design, A New History, a sweeping history of graphic design from the Industrial Revolution to the present, which is now in its third edition. So on this episode, I was interested in talking to Stephen about how he conceived of this book, deciding what goes in it and what does not, how he kept it relevant while still knowing that there are parts of it that would likely be out of date by the time it came out. We also talked about the value of looking at these histories and the value of history books generally. We also talk about his design history book and the challenges in writing about design in a moment where it intersects with every area of modern life. If you liked this episode and what we do here at Scratching the Surface, I hope you consider supporting us on Patreon. Patreon supporters get bonus interviews, full transcripts of every episode, and an exclusive monthly newsletter. Patreon supporters help keep this show free for everyone. And so if you like what we do here and want to help support it, you can head over to patreon.com/surfacepodcast to sign up. Thanks for listening, and here is my conversation with Stephen Eskilson. I want to start with sort of the biggest question. I want to start with the biggest question. What is digital design?
Right. Obviously, an elastic term, if
Yeah,
ever
yeah.
there was one. I would just say that any design, you see, the trick there is design more than digital. I'd say, yeah,
Oh, tell me more.
any design using computers.
Okay.
Fine. You used a computer, it's digital design. But then design, of course, has become such an expansive term in recent years. I don't know if you saw this, and I don't remember the whole article, but like the MIT Technology Review earlier this year, they had it like a drop quote, which was essentially, if everything is design, is anything design?
Right,
Was
right.
sort of their question. I was like, wow, that's right on, because the term seems to just have really encompass just about anything that people make.
That's sort of why I asked you that, because, your book, which is called Digital Design, A History,
Hmm.
just came out, and I opened it thinking that I knew what it was going to be about. I thought this was going to be about web design. I thought it was going to be about animation. I thought it was going to be about like user interface,
Hmm.
mobile apps, and all of those things are in there.
Right.
But it's so much more than that. You're
Mhm.
talking about architecture. You're talking about VR. You're talking about like physical products.
Yeah.
And you sort of you say this early is that in many ways all design is digital at this point. And so I'm wondering how, with these two terms, digital and design, that can be really elastic, especially when you put them together. How did you like sort of put a framework around that about what this book was going to include? How did you sort of delineate this is part of the history? This, I'm leaving this out for right now. How'd you do that?
I mean, right, you're right. That's really where the rubber hits the road, and I think that is generally, with me at least, an organic process. Like I'm going to say, well, I'm going to start with some low hanging fruit. Like I'm going to write about April Greiman and everyone else, iconic digital design. And then while I'm working on that, what you hope at least is I'm going to say, oh, what would fit here is this. And this would connect to this other thing. And actually, I'm going to peel that off and make it its own chapter. So it's something that sort of gradually builds,
Right.
and you're structuring and restructuring as you go along. And again, there's the obvious stuff, but then I really want to include, I mean, the term fringe is maybe too extreme, but wanted to include works that would sort of be at the margin, sort of experimental things.
uh
And you don't know in the beginning, you start writing, you don't know where they're going to fit.
I really admire you for doing this book, because in many ways this a book on digital design feels like a fool's errand.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
like no one's going to be happy
Right.
about, you're going to leave something out, or some specific strand of
Oh,
design is not going to be included. But then also, this stuff changes so fast. I
yes.
mean, it's probably since you submitted the final manuscript to the day we're talking, there are new things that are changing how we think of and talk about digital design. And so, how did you tell me why this book now, and how you tried to sort of reconcile that you're talking about a history, but you're also talking about a history that is changing right before our eyes?
Yes, it is. It is not like you're, writing about Quattrocento painting or something.
Right, right.
There is, and so obviously the the great tsunami in the digital world for the last year has been AI, and
Hmm.
especially late last fall with Chat GPT. So to give you a sense of the schedule, I was just able to get a couple paragraphs about chatbots the
Right.
last time I was allowed to actually make changes to the manuscript. But it is, as you said, I mean, there's a couple different things there. It is so fluid and dynamic, and you can say that, wow, if I was starting today, you'd be ending with AI, and you would, and I do in a way. I'm
Yeah.
talking a lot about AI. I'm not specifically about the chat bots, and maybe not with the same amount of fervor that there is today. But that's where you would finish today, right? That'd be yeah. You're structuring this book today. You're like, I'm going to finish with AI dystopia. So I think you're absolutely also right, and it's why, of course, we call it a history.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Would be to deflect something that has come up where, I mean, I'm sure there's got to be things in there that people would feel, you misrepresented that. It's not exactly like that,
Hmm.
or
Hmm.
or you should have emphasized this. So yeah, I'm ready to roll with the punches.
What was interesting to me, in one way, I kind of thought that maybe you were sort of getting around this sort of ever changing nature of this history that you're writing, is that in many ways, I read this book less as a history of digital design and more of putting what we now think of as digital design into a historical context,
Yeah.
um, if that makes sense. And so you go back to the 50s, the 60s, and sort of show us how we got to this moment. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that framing, because you sort of go through this. You look at architecture, you look at type design, you look at print design and how that sort of emerged with desktop computing, and then how
Yeah.
that then transitioned to the web. Can you talk about that sort of going back and almost showing us the prehistory, I guess, or how did that framing sort of come about, and does that framing sort of sound right to you?
That really does sound right to me. And I think you know, I started with this premise, which of course I kind of flog early on in the book. And the premise is that there's way too much futurist
Uh,
speculation when
this
it
was my
comes
next question. Yeah.
when it comes to digital tech,
Yeah.
and that it is much more embedded in history. I have a belief that people, by and large, are pretty straightforward. They want autonomy and love and companionship and friendship. And those motivations don't change that
Mm,
much. And so when I look at digital design, I'm always seeing the past.
mm,
I'm not seeing the future because I don't think I can, and I think there is plenty of evidence that's you are really getting into um, really overly speculative ground. So I feel much more comfortable, looking at something that happened 50 years ago.
I wanted to hear you talk more about that sort of argument that you make at the beginning of the book. The first chapter is called The Visionaries, and you sort of critique this mindset that when we talk about the digital, and I'm putting quotes around
Mhm.
that, so often that is speculative, so often that is people thinking about what might happen as opposed to looking back or looking at what is happening sort of in the moment. And obviously you're a historian, you have a bias,
Yeah.
a bias there. But tell me about that tension, and tell me about why you wanted to make this argument early in the book that there is value not just in looking forward but also in looking back, in putting all of this in context.
It probably really started with Marshall McLuhan,
Mm,
who I've sort of had an obsession for a long time, back
yeah.
probably when he made a cameo in Annie Hall.
Yes.
And um, I always thought that his career and the way it jumped technology from being essentially about
Yep.
television
Yep.
to him being this sort of posthumous digital
Yeah.
guru had always fascinated me. And especially because, as I say in the book, I think a lot of the things he said were brilliant, but they were sort of brilliant in their silliness,
Right.
more than brilliant in their brilliance. And so I really initially kind of focused on him. And at the same time, I was like, the reason there are luminaries like this is because there's such a burden put on digital design. You're not,
Mm.
at the least, you're supposed to disrupt something entirely. But it's like the fate of humanity is tied to digital design in in some things you would write or read.
So can we talk about some of the specifics
Sure.
in the book? And I come to this through a graphic design background, and so I was obviously really sort of interested in that. And like I said, the book is more than just graphic design. We'll talk about graphic design later when we talk about your other history book. Um,
Mhm.
but I was one of the most interesting pieces of the book to me was your chapter on what you call digital print and web. And you mentioned April Greiman earlier, and I'm glad you brought her up because I thought your section on her was so interesting to me because I had not, and this also speaks to what we were just talking about sort of putting her into a historical context.
Yep.
Um, and so I want to read something that you write, and then ask you about it. In that chapter, you write the first digital innovation in graphic design outside the computer industry came through print. In the late 80s, as computers emerged as design tools, print was graphic design. Furthermore, the first digital graphics to break through into the mainstream were designed in a style that, in fact, had no digital roots. This situation comes up repeatedly through digital design history, in which many works that are celebrated as establishing a new digital aesthetic actually represent the digitization of something older. And I loved that because A, that immediately made sense to me, and B, I had never thought about it that way before. And so you talk about how Greiman studied with Wolfgang Weingart,
Yep.
that was not working digitally. Can you talk to me about that transition and about how so much early graphic design that we think of as part of the digital revolution, um, how that got connected to the digital revolution, but those sort of earlier roots that led us there?
Right. I mean, that's something that totally fascinates me. So, like in Greiman's case, it's all about these layers, and people look at it and
Mm-hmm.
they see software,
Right.
and uh, it is, of course, something that had been done for decades, and I would imagine, and I, of course, can't speak for her, that it is something she'd been exposed to, all the sort of novel ways of producing things with various types of essentially plastic sheets of one sort or
Mm-hmm.
another
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
adding these layers. And when I look at like her design quarterly piece, uh, that's what I see.
Right.
And then what really fascinates me is this disjunction. Like if people are talking digital design a little later in the mid 90s, you have to print everything out.
Right.
It's like there is no digital design. You're reading Wired magazine. It's got day glow colors and layers and distortions. And but wait, you've printed out the internet, except there
Right.
really is no internet.
Right.
And
Well,
so
so
that moment, I love that moment.
and you compare Greiman and you sort of contrast her work with David Carson's work.
Yes.
And you write about how Greiman's work looks digital. We see that as digital, even though, that early work was not, where Carson's never does. And so can you talk about how this idea of something looking digital, where did that come from? Or why does Greiman's work look why does Greiman's work sort of suggest digitalness in a way that Carson's does not?
Well, I think part of it is, and again, for me, this would go back to, Weingart, Dan Friedman,
Mm-hmm.
milieu, that she was a leader in. And that it's the iconography itself is kind of futuristic. There's like abstract graphics, and then there's sort of, what seem to be views of outer space, as I remember the design
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
quarterly piece.
Mm-hmm.
While you look at early Carson, and it is so grounded. So in my mind, and this analogy might be strained, um, Greiman is like Plato. Her iconography points to the theoretical, to the
Uh,
heavens.
uh,
And Carson is like Aristotle, and he's looking at the world around him and saying, no, you design the gritty reality right in front of you. So I guess it's sort of a really kind of a gut thing with me.
yeah. I mean, when I was reading that, I was thinking about the work of Nancy Skolos and Tom Waddell, who also have
Mhm.
a new monograph out. And what's really interesting, and they talk about this in their book, is um, in the 80s, they were doing things by hand, sort of that early Greiman work. You're talking about
Mhm.
plastics, and then they were photographing it all. There was nothing done digital. But their clients thought the work was digital.
Yes, right.
And then it switched where then um, when computers became more widely accessible, everyone thought that their work was not digital. Like there was this like flip that happened,
Yes.
and I don't know if I have a question there, but I find this idea of something looking digital. Does that boils down to sort of like a futurism, you think, or is there more to it than that?
No, I think it is largely a futurism. It can also it can be as simple as the palette they choose.
Mm.
And but again, I go more. Maybe I'm being in a way too literal minded. The style can trick you, so I often rely on the content, if you will.
Uh,
So, and that's of course to me this great paradox is I still remember when I first discovered that David Carson's work wasn't all handmade. I kind of
right,
foolishly thought like, oh my goodness, grunge, you're laboring away. Everything has got that touch of the hands.
right.
And I was like, oh my goodness, I'm so wrong about this. And it's made me very wary. Because like you said, somebody could hand you something, tell you it's digital design or vice versa. And uh, it might it might not be what it seems.
And I think what's so interesting about that, and what's interesting about the book, is that a lot of the book, so much of what you have to do in this book is that you're actually writing about the tools of creation,
Hmm.
almost equally to the output of those tools.
Yeah.
And in in thinking about the design of the tools, the evolution of the tools, and then the evolution of their output, can you
Hmm.
talk a little bit about how those start to influence each other, and how new digital tools were changing how we think of digital design and what digital design can be, and then vice versa, how sort of that evolution was then changing the
Well,
tools? I'm interested in that sort of overlap.
Well, let me see. Like, what I'm fascinated by there is the way the tools in, software, broadly speaking, have become so complex.
Mm,
And it's been going on for decades now. There was a time in the kind of early digital where someone with a little moxie could sit down and sort of figure it out, maybe ask
uh,
for a few tips.
mm,
And now there has been this just enhancements, if you will, the software to a point where I think it is really hard for many people to grapple with. And what I think that leads to is kind of channeling. And this is something I think it's Art Chantry who has spoken about over the years, where the software, especially it's just like a UX UI issue, is going to steer you into certain kinds of forms.
yeah, yeah.
And it's really true. It's really been an issue in digital architecture. So you have, for me, the big back and forth with the work has got to do with how difficult some of these software tools uh, are to use effectively.
I wonder if that speaks to, I was much more familiar with the graphic design side of this. Again, is we talk about postmodernism, we talk about sort
Mhm.
of this layered work of Greiman or Carson. Um, we talk about this sort of move away from modernist graphic design with the rise of the computer, and I think all of that is true.
Mhm.
um but you also talk about how a lot of contemporary digital design has fallen back into sort of, I think you refer to them as like Bauhaus principles. There
Right.
has been a retreat from that type of let's push the tools as far as they can go. And so I look at something like like Greiman's work, or Frank Gehry, who you write about,
Mhm.
and then I look at the interface of Google.
Yeah.
um, and that sort of experimentation has sort of um, gone away. It's like the sort of formal inventiveness that these tools were sold to us 30 years ago uh, is no longer a selling point.
Yeah.
Is that because of the complexity of the tools? Was that just like a new tool? Let's play with it. Can you sort of talk about that a little bit?
I mean, it's interesting because there's a couple different things there. I I do I have at times wondered if a love of a, sort of minimalist aesthetic has got to do with sort of resistance against the shock and awe of like trying to pick up Maya or even
Mm,
Photoshop these
mm.
days and trying to build a career using it. It's you're going to suddenly realize you're looking at a many years of learning, and it's like, well, hey, but if we embrace this Bauhaus style, and one of my obsessions is big tech's endless flogging of
Yeah.
what they claim is the Bauhaus, and partly is.
Yeah.
So yeah, I worry that it's a paradox here, right? The companies are going to tell you that After Effects or something is getting so much better, and it's going to make you so much more creative, and they have wonderful branding and advertisements to that effect. But in reality, it's becoming the anti sandbox, a sandbox like you can play in, right? It's
That's
You can work
interesting.
stuff out. But these things are not a sandbox. It's like suddenly somebody puts you in charge of the test at the Chernobyl nuclear station. They're like, okay, have at it. And it's like, gosh, there's a lot of dials here.
Do you feel a responsibility in sort of critiquing these systems in a book like this? I mean, because you don't you sort of suggest that at points, but I've never heard you say that as clearly as you just said it to me. Um,
Yeah.
but is that a conscious decision to leave those sort of outside of a quote unquote history book?
I mean, you see, I feel pretty free. That's sort of the trade-off, right? As you said, the earth is turning under my feet and the
Right.
digital world is changing. Since we started, like 7 new things have come on board. And so, but I feel that that gives a certain amount of freedom. So like when I was in undergrad or grad school in art history, there was sort of a rule. The rule was you don't talk about anything that is 20 years old because it's too old. It's too young, excuse me.
Yeah. Right.
And you have absolutely no perspective. So I have a certain amount of freedom because I'm like, 2017, yeah, let me give you a take. It's why this book is, in my mind, best characterized as design history and design writing,
Mm,
because and sometimes it's really trying to plot out a history. Other places it's bordering on criticism.
right. I mean, the reason I ask you that is that you're for I don't know, I guess like a decade at this point, you wrote Graphic Design: A New History, which is now in its third edition. When did
Right.
the first edition of that come out?
Oh, 07, I
Okay,
believe.
so like 15 years
Yeah.
ago. Um, with the most recent one coming out about 4 or 5 years ago,
Yeah.
and in early in that book, you write, and I'm again going to quote you here. You said, "It is my belief that graphic design history has too often been presented through a parade of styles and individual achievements devoid of significant social context, and that this tendency has obscured much of the richness and complexity of its development." In contrast, this book is predicated on the idea that graphic design and typography are the most communal of art forms, and I strive to show how deeply they are embedded in the fabric of society in every era. And I went back to A New History in
Mhm.
thinking about talking to you, and I was really struck by that line that I just read to you. Um, because in many ways digital design is also the most communal of art form. It
Yeah.
has, I'm thinking about social media, I'm thinking about being online, being connected. And I do not mean this to be a critique of the digital design book, but there isn't a lot of that social context in there, and I'm wondering sort of the sort of when you turn those knobs up, if you could sort of talk about talk about sort of that writing process of like, when am I going to sort of bring in the social, the political, the sort of the economics of this, and when am I talking specifically about technological development?
You're right. And ideally there is some sort of synergy there, right, where they're all connected. And I think when the part of this book that is the recent present is where you're in treacherous
Right.
waters, particularly in terms of that realm, and in terms of what's embedded, what's meaningful in society. So what I stay mainly with in the digital design history book is, I hope I'm more skeptic than cynic, but
Mm,
this notion, this endlessly kind of this perpetual present of transformation and disruption, that the only static thing is change. The only thing you can count on is it's always changing, and that is sort of a life's blood to digital design in a
yeah,
way. And it is also, something that corporations, I think, exploit to a great deal. So, see, what you bring up is really interesting because you're making me. I'm sort of thinking out loud here.
yeah, go for it.
Um, but in that, obviously, if you were to, choose your, favorite five big tech companies, there's been a lot more attention, even in just the last few years, to, pernicious business
Hmm.
practices, let's say.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so, how much is that something? You're in a tricky thing because, like, say you're talking about Apple and you're talking about Steve Jobs and iconic, and on the one hand, it's this, it's this celebration, right? This
Hmm.
company did amazing things from this digital design standpoint, and so, yeah, how much do you want to go into the possible doom and gloom? See, I don't want to go the opposite way. I'm skeptical
Right,
of
right.
the, like, everyone's living in this wonderful world, but I don't want to be. I actually say this goes back to McLuhan. I talk a little bit about that. You know, he went all in celebration, and
Right,
before
right.
that, he was best described as a curmudgeon. Like, things he wrote, sort of some obscure scholarly essays,
Yeah,
were very, I think of like Eeyore or something. They're
yeah,
very.
yeah.
So, yeah, I feel sort of trapped in the middle there. That would be
Yeah,
my.
and I get that, and I probably lean more towards the cynic and the skeptic, just to be
Okay.
to sort of to put my cards on the table. And I think, hearing you say that, and what I'm sort of struck by is, we've seen a sort of opinion shift in the last 5, 6, 7 years
Mhm.
about sort of popular perception of big tech.
Yeah.
Um, Facebook went from, being this sort of great tool that makes us more open and connected to is destabilizing democracy. Same
Yeah.
Google, Apple, Amazon, all of these. The opinions have sort of shifted there.
Yeah.
And what's interesting to me is that many of those discussions talk about these companies as tech companies,
Mhm.
uh, and in many ways they are also design companies. We
Yeah.
interact with them through design, through interfaces, through stores.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering about designs, and now I'm talking out loud, sort of
No,
thinking about this.
yes, please.
What is design's role here? If Facebook is making the world more open and connected, uh then design is a force for good. But if Facebook is destabilizing democracy, then design is destabilizing,
Yeah.
and designers are destabilizing democracy. And I guess I'm sort of wondering sort of where we, if we can draw those lines, or sort of how we can sort of think about that, the implications of our work in this sort of global technological context.
See, and I mean, you bring up an interesting issue in terms of this notion of, like, design's culpability for,
Yeah, yeah.
name whatever sort of social ill or situation don't like. And that's something that I kick around a lot in my mind, because at times it's sort of like at the beginning when I was talking about this MIT article. When everything's become design,
Right.
the use of the term it's become denuded of much meaning.
Yes.
And so I really, I'm not sure if I blame design, because I'm like, well, what do you mean by design? Because to a certain degree, the core meaning is which customized sans serif typeface your brand is going to rely on.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that probably doesn't have a meaningful impact in these big issues.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so then it's like, well, now you're getting into the expanded notion of design. And I do believe in this, right? I do believe there are instances where designers are going to frame something in such a way that it's going to become part of the cultural conversation. Again, probably organically. It might, I'm not saying in some sort of predatory planned sense. And it's going to end up shaping the way people see something. And it might be in a way you think, wow, that's not the way that should be shaped.
Right. Right.
What I have trouble with is, can you predict that?
Right.
You know,
Right.
those big moments where design is not the window dressing, design's the engine.
Yes, yes. I think that is very well said. So let me ask you this, because you actually sort of set up what I was thinking about for this next question.
Mhm.
Writing a history book of graphic design, and graphic design in many ways is just as elastic
Yeah,
as digital design, and we see this in higher education where programs are changing their name.
yeah,
Graphic design, visual communication, communication design, graphic communication,
yes.
user experience design, which is just like you sort of graphic design programs, but they're just
Digital media.
digital media. Yeah. Creative technology, you see
Yeah.
all of these. um how do you sort of define graphic design today, and do you think what what is happening today, the interfaces of these platform, all of this, is this graphic design, or how does this work? How does this sort of digital design connect to graphic design history, maybe, is the question. Is that term still a useful container for this?
I mean that that's really interesting. It's something I talk about with students a lot. The term I think dates back to the 1920s in Dwiggins, and I will say, speaking of social media, there's a group you might have gotten on. I think it's actually on Facebook, of graphic design professors
uh
who recently discussed this. And like you said, it's is there a better term? Does it sound sort of like something that has ended in a way? And the consensus I keep saying is, we haven't done any better yet. Now, going to the second part of your conversation, I can remember of your question. I can remember, say, the early 2000s when I'm first working on the graphic design book, talking to friends who worked in print and saying to them, so, like, web design, is that graphic design?
right.
And many of them saying no, right?
Right.
Saying no, that's an offshoot. And it's interesting to see how that's changed, because it's
Right.
become like what many people think of as the beating heart, especially in a lot of graphic design programs, because it's something that I think has a certain sort of sizzle that attracts students.
Right.
And so now, uh, digital design, graphic design, right? It sounds like, well, in graphic design, you're printing out your emails or something, something frowned upon like that, from the 20th century. Um, so part of the expanded field is, of course, made it harder. I was saying earlier, it's hard to deal with this technology. The other thing, though, is conceptually. I go and I'm a graphic design major today, and right off, they're going to start talking about experience and
hmm
culture. So now
hmm
you're saying, I don't just have to make this look good and sort of understand why it looks good and how to do that. I got to do the eye candy part still. So I guess I'll just go with the Bauhaus style. But then,
Oh, right. It's like the design program, like a higher education design program, is like the complexity of the tools that we
yeah,
were talking about earlier.
exactly.
Yeah.
Because conceptually, they're going to throw all this stuff at you. They're going to be like, "Oh, here's Roland Barthes.
Yeah.
Go read that. His critique of advertising in mid-century was really important." You're like, open this book
Yeah.
translated from the French, and you're just like, wait, I thought I was going to learn Photoshop. And boy, is Photoshop complicated.
Right. Well, I mean, to keep quoting your books, but at the
Mhm.
end of the latest edition of it, Graphic Design and New History,
Yeah,
you said something that I've thought about. You write something that I've thought about a lot, which speaks to this, I think. You write, the quest for meaning in graphic design is partly a product of its rich artistic side. While accountants or engineers may not usually be beset with finding larger meaning in their work, graphic designers have often asked abstract questions along these lines. One thing that is abundantly clear, however, is that there will be a continuing demand for designers who have a sophisticated awareness of history, technology, and contemporary culture. And I think this speaks to what we're talking about here because, um, the argument that I see in that, and I think the argument that you make in that book, is that graphic design isn't just a technical field.
right.
It isn't just problem solving in a way that engineering maybe is, that it is also a type of, cultural production.
Yeah.
It is also a type of narrative and storytelling. It is both um, technical and cultural. And I'm wondering about this sort of, designers wanting meaning, and how you think about that today in this world where all these terms are so elastic. um how do you think about sort of the value of graphic design, or the meaning of graphic design?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I feel like there's in many ways this kind of real stratification in a way
Hmm.
between the students and then uh, a lot of graphic designers who, like yourself, are history and theory, uh, compelled to
Yeah.
explore it, and in that way, the kind of cultural depths. And I, of course, love graphic design because, like you just said, it's got every dimension,
Right.
right?
Right.
And I go back to uh, I'm the famous IDEO design thinking
Mm.
notion, which is is something that was such a rage for so long. And one of the things that I can't think of his name right now, I think it's Tim something, but
Yeah,
maybe I'm
Tim
thinking of
Brown.
that.
Tim
Oh, it
Brown.
is. Okay, right.
Yeah.
Right. He would have like the three things that went into it: people, technology, and business. And what I appreciate about that was really the business side, because I feel this conversation too much in graphic design has been, well, if you're that you can't have your cake and eat it too. Like if you're the counterculture designer and you're, thoughtful, and
Mm.
you have to sort of align yourself against business. And we've seen this there in a lot of, think of like TDR or something. And
Yeah.
I speak in the books of like what I describe as at some of these designers almost a self-loathing about commercial work. And I've always thought that's you're missing out on one of the big dimensions of the field. And you can bring all those together in an ethical way. And again, in a roundabout way, what I'm saying is that's why, to me, like graphic design, contemporary graphic design versus, like, say, contemporary art,
Hmm.
contemporary graphic design is so much more interesting to me because the commercial side of it gives it some structure.
Mm. Right.
There, it is a job.
Right.
And that is a great thing in focusing people's attention. People are living their lives and trying to pay their mortgage, and they're in a real complicated situation at times.
Is there going to be a new edition of Graphic Design and New History at any point?
Okay, well, it's
Or can you talk about that?
no, no. I mean, you know, October 17th, I guess yesterday, the new book came out, and I was, kicking around. What am I going what am I going to do now?
Yeah.
Or at least in a few weeks. And I definitely think there's space for it. Like if Uh, if you asked me, is it time? Is there something you could do? And I would say, yeah, absolutely,
Yeah.
because there's just so much more information. Number one, on non-Western design traditions.
Yep.
I'm talking about a very practical matter. Even, say the third edition of that book, I was probably writing it 5 years ago. The difference between 5 years ago today
Yeah.
is just it's it's stunning. And I'd already seen it between like the second and third editions, but it's really accelerated. And
Yeah.
so I'd be really excited to see. I think the Western I have nailed down about as well as I can do, but I would love to, um, because it's a problem like just simple things like practical matters, like language. Like someone says, "Oh, you should write more about graphic design in XYZ country." It's
Yeah.
like, well, to be frank, I don't understand what's written about it there. So that has changed, and like the English speaking world now,
Yeah.
I think you can learn a lot, and I could do that.
Well, that's
As
and
well
that's
too.
exactly why I asked that question. I have like two more questions to wrap up, because what is so interesting to me about this conversation that we're having, and about both graphic design, new history, and your new book, digital design,
Mhm.
is that we can talk about graphic design as a profession, as a job. We can talk about it as problem solving. We can also talk about it as cultural production, as content generation. We can talk about it as it relates to business. We can talk about it as it relates to culture. We can talk about it as it relates to politics. We can talk about it as it relates to technology and to the tools. And so, in many ways, a history of design is a history of culture. It's
Yeah.
a history of society, of how people live together. And I'm wondering, and then there are all of these movements which are so welcome, of these expanded histories of non-Western history, all of this. And I'm wondering, when a history gets so big,
Yeah.
to encompass all of these things, whether that is sort of decolonization and non-Western histories,
Mhm.
but also just sort of alternative practices, non-commercial practices, cultural practices. What do you see as the value of like these big history books? Do are they? And I'm not asking you to sort of critique your own work or say that a new edition is not necessary, but what what is the value of a book like that, and how do you tell a history like that when it encompasses so many different things? And
I
is
mean,
that even of value?
no, I think where the value is going to be in what synergy you can find there. So in other words, you're absolutely right. If like, okay, you're going to take something, you're going to tack on, five non-Western works and say, yeah, in each of these places they also have graphic design.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're just sort of, that's kind of performative. And so what I would like to think is that you can do it in a way where it is synthesized. And so it
Mm.
all resonates. It doesn't feel like
Right.
it's, these chunks of things, but that it flows together. So I would like to think that is what I could do, that I'd be in an easier situation.
Yeah.
I think back, you can imagine with either of these books, going back to digital design with so many topics. I can remember still like that first day,
Yeah.
sort of like
Yeah.
thinking like, whoa, you know, where do I go from here?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that it's all, to me, it is all about the connections you can make. Some might be far fetched. In the new book, I I make this connection between Nikita Fall's shot paintings and first
Right.
person shooters.
Right. Right.
And it's something I feel there is something there.
Yeah.
So I'm looking to connect things in that way.
My last question for you is the last question that I used to end all of these. Your book just came out, and so you have some downtime,
Yeah,
hopefully.
for
What are
sure.
you reading right now?
Okay, what am I reading? So There's something funny about this because I was reading, I don't know if you've seen this meme lately. There's this joke about people thinking about Rome.
Yes. Yeah. I don't
Yes.
know. I don't understand what this is or where this came from, but
I
I have
don't
seen
know.
this.
I think it's like a TikTok thing or something.
Okay.
But I will say the funny thing that you asked me that is, Mary Beard publishes with Princeton
Oh,
a,
right.
a lot of works about Rome, and that I have a few of them, and I've been sort of jumping around and reading about Rome, and I was like, oh my goodness, it's like this unbelievable cliche. Like,
You are
when
the
did you last?
cliche. Yeah.
Yes, I was thinking about Rome today,
I love
so
it.
not digital.
Well, your book is called Digital Design, A History. It is just recently released. I think it does a great job, like I said, of contextualizing really this moment that we're in right now, and sort of, it really helped me sort of understand how we got here. And I really enjoyed this conversation and sort of
Me too.
picking at these ideas at a, sort of, maybe more meta level. So, Stephen, thanks for being on the show.
Well, thanks so much. It was great fun.
That was my conversation with Stephen Eskilson. It was recorded on October 18th, 2023. His new book, Digital Design and History, is now available from Princeton University Press. Our theme music is by Jeremiah Chu. The show is and always will be free, thanks to the generosity of our Patreon supporters. If you like what we're doing around here, I hope you consider supporting us and get some bonus content each month. You can follow us across social media at Surface Podcasts, and you can listen to all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.